What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. In today's video, we dive into something a little bit different, just as Crimson Vow is on the horizon. Whether you're seeing this video before it releases on the Arena client or afterwards, we're going to be diving into some decks, and I'm going to be looking to try it out and kind of tweaking as Crimson Vow is around. As I can't test these decks, so the cards I'm adding in from the set, I'm unsure of how they're going to perform until I actually really play them. But with that being said, I am going to be diving into 4 decks that I'm going to be playing with the new set Crimson Vow. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about them. So you may be wondering yourself, how am I actually be able to show you the decks if the cards aren't available currently in Arena? I'm going to dive onto my Aether Hub deck list that I have, where I list mostly all the decks I post here on the channel. There'll be links down for each of these decks in the description below, so if you want to add them to your collection once they become live on Arena, you can go ahead and do so. But the first deck we'll be talking about is a Selesnya Humans deck. Now, there's a few things I'm going to say here real quick about Crimson Vow before we kind of dive into it. I feel like when Innistrad Midnight Hunt first came out, I felt like we were lacking some of the cards that I think, that make some of these archetypes possibly that much better. So like with Crimson Vow coming out, I feel like we're getting essentially an expansion pack to the original Innistrad set, which I think benefits a lot of the decks that came out of Crimson Vow, whether it be humans, zombies, vampires, so on and so forth. I think this is definitely one of those decks that does benefit from this set, focusing on one of those creature archetypes. With that being said, I mean, overall the deck is pretty interesting from what it already had. There's cards from Innistrad Midnight Hunt that still make the list. There's also cards that you would see typically in like a mono white version, but we're only keeping in like the humans out of that for the most part. But overall, the deck list is pretty interesting nonetheless. In the 1-drop slot, we do have our Chaplain of Alms. A 1-mana, 1/1 first striker with Ward 1, which is definitely pretty cool. Definitely something to be a little bit more aggressive. Definitely a decent blocker with it having first strike. Ward 1 definitely makes it harder for our opponent to remove it because it makes whatever they're targeting it with that cost that much more. The other thing about it is, unfortunately, Ward doesn't protect you from a board wipe, so it does still, overall, still cost a normal amount. It also has Disturb, so when it actually comes back with its Disturb cost, it does also give all your creatures Ward 1, which is definitely pretty cool. Nonetheless, overall pretty good card that definitely makes sense to be in this human style deck. After that, we do have Usher of the Fallen. You may be wondering yourself, why do we have Usher of the Fallen? Well, it's a 1-mana 2/1, which is already amazing in that sense. But the other ability too is the boast. I do think people forget about the boasting effect. Typically in mono white, they're usually just trying to play these cheaper creatures, get very wide on your opponent. And you don't typically boast unless you're really that desperate for a play. But having Usher of the Fallen, tap in 2 mana to get a 1/1 human creature token, definitely pretty decent of an effect that definitely fits well with our mold of a thing. What we're trying to do here, it's one of those things. If you really strictly want to play humans, you can always cut Usher of the Fallen. But like I said, it's a 2/1 attacker that is definitely allows you to be the aggressor in the matchup overall as a whole. After that, we do have a couple copies of Rally the Ranks. Just as one of those things, because we are playing white, might as well add a couple copies of this. As Rally the Ranks enters the battlefield, we get to choose a creature type. More than likely, we're going to choose humans, and creatures of that chosen type get +1/+1. So it's like our board pump effect. Enchantments are technically kind of hard to get rid of on the battlefield unless your opponent has something that directly targets an enchantment. But for the most part, in a best-of-1 matchup, your opponent's not really going to be playing, enchantment removal unless it's like an additional thing that they can target with their particular spell they're playing. But for the most part, this will be on the battlefield once you play it for almost the long haul when it comes to the game itself. After that, we actually added a couple copies of Kabira Takedown. Because the deck isn't, the most expensive, we can play multiple things or have X amount of creatures out in the battlefield at any given time. Kabira Takedown is like our decent spot removal in a way. Worst case scenario, if our opponent's not playing, a creature deck or something we need to use Kabira Takedown to get rid of, we can always play it on the battlefield tapped as a white mana source, which is okay in that sense. But other than that, we do have that little bit of removal if we do need it. Next, we have Catilda, Dawnheart of the Prime. She is our 1/1 2-mana creature that has protection from werewolves and makes all our humans have the ability to tap, add 1 mana of any of the creature token colors. So essentially, most of the deck is white, so most of our creatures will add white mana. Our multicolored creatures will add green or white, which is definitely beneficial, but in a weird way, it kind of gives our deck a little bit of that additional ramp. If you get her out on possibly turn 2 or 3, you may have other creatures out on the battlefield in that sense. So you will possibly have some additional mana that you can play more things and get very wide very, very quickly, which is definitely going to be good for us if we're trying to overwhelm our opponent with just a bunch of, even if they're small humans, just a bunch of humans overall is definitely going to help us in the long run. Also, in the late game, if we do have a decent amount of mana out, we can tap 6 mana or tap things that will equal 6 mana and give our creatures overall +1/+1 for a green, a white, and 4 colorless. Just kind of adds overall flair to our humans deck nonetheless, so definitely cool in that sense. Another card that makes the cut in the humans deck is the Intrepid Adversary. It is a 2 mana 3/1 lifelinker with the ability that when it comes into the battlefield to pay additional colorless and a white, and we at X amount of times, depending on how much open mana we do have available. It enters the battlefield with that many counters on it, giving it +1/+1. Giving creatures we control +1/+1 even itself, so essentially makes itself a bigger creature. So in a weird way, it's also like a copy of Rally the Ranks, but built into a creature, though it does cost additional mana if we do, decide to put X amount of counters on it equal to the mana we have available. But nonetheless, it is also a creature, also a thing that pumps creatures, so overall good card that fits well with our strategy. As we go back up to the top in the second row, this is kind of like, I know it's a little clunky. We are on a web page. It doesn't work as well as the client in that regard, but I do apologize. But we go to the Luminarch Aspirant. I think this is kind of like a staple in any deck that plays any sort of white and is trying to play aggro. Because, it's a 2 mana 1/1, but at the beginning of our combat, we have to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Just making our creature that much tougher to deal with and, be annoying possibly against our opponent. Definitely can target our Chaplain with this, make our Chaplain from a 1/1 now to a 2/2 for a striker, which is definitely even better of a blocker. So overall has some pretty decent synergies with a lot of the stuff we do have in the deck. Though it doesn't work like by putting this on top of our Intrepid Adversary. You can't stack, +1/+1 counters and its loyalty counters in that regard. So it doesn't make our board have, additional pumps. So if we only pay 2 mana for the Intrepid and play, the Cleric, we can't just add more +1/+1 counters to our whole board. So that doesn't work like that, but I do think, like I said, a card that is a staple in any deck that plays any sort of white and aggro. A new card that we're going to try out here is we're going to try Thalia, Guardian of the Thrabryn. We aren't going to play Snowlands, so we're not going to play Redain in the deck, but we are going to try to play it in this regard to kind of slow down our possible opponents who are playing, any sort of non-creature spell decks or heavy in the non-creature spells with not many creature sources. So this is kind of going to be our, hopefully way to slow them down from playing, those like Blood on the Snows, Alrund's Epiphanies, things like that. It is a 2 mana 2/1. It is legendary. We can only have one of them. We can't tax our opponent multiple times by having multiple Thalias out. But it's a 2/1 for a striker. Like I said, just an overall board presence of giving non-creature spells cost 1 more, as well as it does give our non-creature spells cost 1 more, but we don't really play that many, so it is kind of like one of those best of both worlds in our deck as a whole. But definitely a card that, we'll see how it plays out when it comes to, the standard meta as a whole. Is it going to be a card that's going to make the cut in a lot of main decks, or is it going to be a card that, just falls into the sideboard and comes in when it needs to? So we're first going to test it and see how it does, and then go from there. Then we have Adeline. If you haven't seen her, she is a 3 mana star 4. Her power is equal to the amount of creatures that you have out on the battlefield. So she goes up the more creatures we have out. If she's the only one out, she's a 1/4. And then every time that we attack, we put a 1/1 human creature token into the battlefield, untap. Also, she has Vigilance, so she can attack and also be a blocker at the same time. Definitely a great card to kind of have that overall presence that generally creates more threats as she becomes more and more aggressive. Like I said, in the early game, you want to kind of build up your board presence, whether you play your 1-drops, your 2-drop, and then possibly here on turn 3, and then slowly build up that sort of board presence. So definitely a good card. I think that works very well in the humans deck. Add some +1/+1 counters from, either a Rally the Ranks or Intrepid Adversary. She becomes this overall big, powerful creature that your opponent definitely has to deal with, or she's going to get out of hand pretty quickly when it comes to its overall power. But nonetheless, Adeline is definitely a great card for the human meta. We also have Brutal Cathar, just because Brutal Cathar is a human soldier, even though it's also a werewolf. But the idea here is it's kind of like that, let's get rid of some of our opponent's creatures that they have out on the battlefield. It's great for attacking our opponent's token creatures. If they have any sort of token creature, it automatically exiles them, and they pretty much essentially just get nullified. They don't, go underneath the Brutal Cathar, and they just go away. So it's definitely good there. It also starts creating a day-bound, night-bound cycle. So if our opponent's not really playing anything too crazy, are playing a lot of spells, or possibly playing any spells, we can start, flipping him either side depending on how the matchup goes. So definitely good in that sense. He becomes a 3/3. And I believe also has ward of I think it's like one of those pay X life. I think it's 3 life, and they can target it or it gets countered. So definitely a good card that way. And then if it flips back over, we can do the effect over again and over again, depending on how many times it goes daybound, nightbound, nonetheless. But definitely a cool card. Definitely, because we can't play the 3 mana spirit in this slot. We're gonna play Gruul Warewolves as that kind of like makeshift one because it fits in our archetype. So overall, pretty decent there. But they do get the creature back if it does die. We do have also Elite Spellbinder. We have 2 copies of these things because, like I said, we're testing them out. We're going to see how the deck overall performs. If we like a particular card or if it's performing exceptionally well, maybe we'll add more copies and cut something that we don't like. So we have 2 copies of Elite Spellbinder, but, there's nothing better than, messing up your opponent's mana curve or whatever they're curving out on the battlefield. So overall, Elite Spellbinder is a key card that kind of helps us, kind of slow down our opponent. Possibly also if our opponent's playing something and not playing a lot of things, we want to dig in and see what our opponent's up to. It's a great card that kind of spies on our opponent's hand, and making something cost 2 extra to play is definitely very good and nonetheless. And it's also a 3/1 flyer, so that also helps out with our situation. So the next new card in the deck list that I'm kind of messing around with that, is something that's fairly interesting is Tauren's. It's a 3 mana 2/2, and then whenever we cast a creature spell, we create a 1/1 green white human creature token with training. It also itself has training, and if you don't know what training is, it's new ability. If it attacks and there's another creature on the battlefield that has, I believe, greater power than it. Let me just kind of go to this card real quick because it has training. So that doesn't have training. Crap. Where do we have training? Okay, here we go. Whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So essentially, it's a creature that becomes bigger. Then we also get 1/1 green white human creature tokens that also will have training. And so if we attack with this, we'll get a creature token as well with training. And then if we attack with this and that on the next turn, the token will grow, and then we'll get another token. So it's kind of one of those things that every time we cast something, we'll just get creatures that eventually get bigger and bigger the more we attack in with them, as other creatures get bigger and bigger out on the battlefield. So overall, an interesting card. It's a 2 because 1, it's legendary. 2, I don't really know how effective training is going to be overall as a mechanic. When mechanics are new, you got to play it with a grain of salt. You don't want to invest too heavily into a mechanic. But like I said, it seems interesting. The deck is an aggro deck, so there's definitely a lot of areas for it to be in the aggressive sense, and training could help us be more aggressive. So definitely something to keep an eye on and see how it develops as Crimson Valley gets released and games are played, and kind of understanding what is good and what is not. Then we go to the top again. We go to Savior Allenblock. It's a 3 mana 1/2 human soldier creature. It is a mythic. It also has training. It's an interesting 3-drop in the sense that whenever it trains, exile up to 1 target creature from the battlefield or a creature from a graveyard. When it leaves the battlefield, put the exile cards onto the battlefield under their owner's control. So it's an interesting card in the sense that we can start, picking off just kind of like, Brutal Cathar. Is this going to be better than Brutal Cathar? I'm not really sure. But the idea that whenever it trains, it exiles something so we continuously do it instead of having to wait for a daybound, nightbound cycle kind of thing to work. So it is one of those things that if this performs fairly well, and we can, trigger training a lot, it could be a card that, just takes over the game. Because once it gets a +1/+1 counter, it becomes a little bit bigger. Once it gets another one, it becomes even bigger. And so on and so forth. So definitely an interesting card to kind of see how it plays out. Even if you do it 2 or 3 times, it's definitely gonna be a card that's gonna, really, hinder what our opponent's trying to do on their side of the battlefield. And the idea here is up to the fact that it can target a creature card on the battlefield and or the graveyard. So if someone has something that can reoccur from the graveyard, or if we do, we can then essentially set up possibly, if they remove this card, we're gonna get all the creatures that may have been removed already from the battlefield back onto the battlefield when this comes back under, when this leaves the battlefield. So definitely an interesting kind of thing to kind of see how it plays out. Nonetheless, it can hinder our opponent, but it can also benefit us in that sense. Then another card that's actually interesting too is Hamlet of the Vanguard. It's a 3 mana 1/1. Doesn't seem very impressive right off the bat. It does have Ward 2, which is definitely pretty cool. If they target with a spell, they'd pay additional 2 mana or it gets countered. But it enters the battlefield, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each non-token human we control. For the most part, our deck does play a lot of, humans, 22 to be exact. So it is definitely going to, trigger at least once, twice, maybe multiple times. If we can trigger at least twice, it enters as a 3 mana 5/5 with Ward 2, which is definitely pretty awesome. It becomes a decent sized blocker that our opponents, is going to have to deal with in some form or capacity. But overall, even if it comes in the even later game, we have a bunch of creatures on the battlefield. It's just going to come in as this giant, plus X creature that our opponents just be like, holy crap, how are we going to deal with this giant creature? The downfall is it doesn't have trample, so opponent can just chump it for days, but it is going to be a big creature that they're going to have to figure out a way to deal with it. So definitely a pretty cool card nonetheless. Then of course, because we are playing humans, we are going to play Sigarda. It is kind of like a human lord in a sense, because it gives all our humans we control +1/+1, though it is an angel, but it does have the Coven ability that whenever it attacks, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, like the top 5 cards of our library, we can reveal a human creature card among them, put it into our hand, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any random, and put them in a random order. So overall, it's a 4/4 for 4 mana that has flying, trample, gives all our humans +1/+1. And on top of it, helps us dig a little bit deeper if we can trigger the Coven ability, which I do think we can because our power in the deck is all diverse enough. I think that we can definitely possibly hit it by the time this is out on the battlefield, so definitely pretty awesome there. Overall, she is fairly powerful, though. It's one of those things we'll also have to wait and see how, these dual, white mana source things are going to play out, just because sometimes the mana can get a little wonky because you want to have an even amount of green, you want to have an even amount of white. We do have a decent amount of land base to kind of hopefully fix that. So hopefully with our land base, we can be able to play her consistently as well as any of our double white things as well consistently. But nonetheless, definitely a good card that fits well in the deck. Could be one of those things that we want to put more copies of her because this is something we definitely want to hit on a consistent basis. So having the 3rd copy at least will help us get there. And I think the digging ability will help us kind of draw, keep our hand kind of consistently flowing with more humans to just play. Just because I do think that's also something that we could struggle with this because white and green doesn't have a lot of ways to really draw cards. Then the last card that we have in the deck that is a creature and also human is the new Cemetery Protector. It is a 4 mana. It's a 4 mana creature that has flash. When it enters the battlefield, exile a creature card from a graveyard. Whenever we play a land or cast a spell that shares a card type with the exiled card, we have to create a 1/1 white human creature token on the battlefield. So it's definitely going to be one of those cards that kind of works well with our deck because we can flash this in at the end of our turn, exile one of our human creatures that may be in the graveyard, put on this, and then if we ever play a land or cast a spell that shares a creature type with that particular card, we're going to create a human creature token out of it, and it's one of those things that can trigger multiple times. So we can play multiple creatures, we can make multiple humans, and just get them wider very quickly. It's one of those things we can overtake our opponent with. The other thing too is in a weird way you can do it to your opponent, but if you actually, did something on your opponent's side, I don't see you really lining up the way to create human creature tokens unless your opponent was also playing humans. But nonetheless, Cemetery Protector is definitely an interesting card that will work well with this, human archetype. Yet again, is it something that we want more copies of? Is 4 enough? Or is 2 enough currently? Time will tell, playtesting will tell. We'll kind of figure it out as the time goes on. And then going on to the mana base, we do have 23 lands. Also, if we count the 2 Kabir takedowns in the main deck, those are 2 additional lands, so maybe 25 lands altogether. But, we have 4 copies of the Birchcraft Pathway. We have 1 Cave of the Forgotten Dragon. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Forest, which definitely is pretty good, I think. There's more white in the deck than there is green, but, making sure we can hopefully consistently draw green mana is always a good source. Having the pathways plus green mana is definitely good in that sense. 1 Lay of the Hydra, just in case, always good to have some, creature lands just in case you have a board wipe. Creature lane can still get in that and maybe finish off your opponent if you get in that position where they're close to almost being the game over. You just want to push that additional damage in, so Lay of the Hydra and Cave of the Forgotten both kind of fit well in that. We also have 4 of the Overgrown Farmlands. Just because it's a great dual land. It's definitely great in the late game. Having an untapped dual land that produces green and white is definitely very good. And we also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total planes. So definitely works overall very, very well. Like I said, this is definitely one of those decks I'm going to be tweaking and kind of adjusting. So the list you may see here is going to be one way, but if you come back in a few days after Cruise of Vows coming out and I can get some games in, kind of see what works and what doesn't, I will try my best to keep the list updated so you can kind of see the progress as the games go on. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's kind of talk about it. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Rakdos Vampires. I feel like this is kind of one of those archetypes that I've been saying, it kind of got a little bit of love with the release of Midnight Hunt, but I think as we kind of played through it, you kind of saw the holes when it comes to the overall power of vampires. I felt like, you could play them if you wanted to, but they just weren't enough to be consistent enough to possibly be competitive. So we are going to dive into Rakdos Vampires, as I do think this is probably the archetype and this is the color scheme you want to play. I will say, I guess, it's Rakdos Vampires with a splash of white. And that's just because there's a new card that's kind of like the Vampire Lord. But I didn't really see any other white vampires I wanted to add. So we're going to splash a little bit of white at the beginning, and maybe if there's other good vampires that maybe pop up that I may want to add, maybe I will add additional white creatures. But really only playing it for this one particular card. But we'll kind of get into him when we kind of get to his slot. But we'll kind of go through the deck list and kind of get in, kind of see what's going on, kind of how I adjusted, and kind of where I'm going to start at, and kind of see where I can go from there. So the first card we have up is the Pit Fighter. It's an interesting vampire creature. You can tap 2 mana, discard a card, sacrifice a vampire, draw 2 cards, and activate it only if an opponent lost life this turn. It's interesting in the sense that it is a 1 mana 2/1, so it definitely allows us to be a little bit more aggressive. The downfall is I do think sacking vampires and not really having a good way to, replace them in the way without casting additional vampires is definitely be a problem. So I only went with 2 copies in that sense, just because I don't want us to really have to worry about sacking all our vampires, just because we want to be aggressive, but we don't want to, lose our creatures in order to be that aggressive. So worst case scenario, you can, swing in with the Pit Fighter on turn 2, sacrifice, discard a card, sacrifice it itself, and actually draw 2 cards. It's kind of like the strategy that you probably want to go with. In my opinion, I don't really think you want to sacrifice one of our other vampires, just because you're not going to get any sort of effect if they do die, kind of thing. So it is one of those things that I think that's kind of the strategy. It's kind of like some fodder, kind of to get a little bit of card draw, but kind of kill itself in the process. We actually are going to go with Valentine Dina the Bane as our other 1-drop in the deck. It is a 4 copies of. It is Menace. It has lifelink, so definitely good in that sense. But I do like the other ability here, just because whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile instead. When you do, we pay 2. If we do, we create a 1/1 black pest creature token. So definitely good in that sense that it creates some token fodder that we can either, if we do have a Pit Fighter out, we can always maybe sacrifice that to possibly then, oh, well, it's not a vampire, it's a pest, so we can't sacrifice it. But just create some fodder to maybe chump block maybe a particular creature our opponent is dealing with. But nonetheless, I do think this is probably slightly better of a creature in that sense, just because I do feel like, its abilities gives it a little bit of life, has menace, so they have to commit 2 things to block it. And then the idea of if the creature dies, it gets exiled, so they can't use their own Agadeem's Awakening or have any sort of way to return that creature back to the battlefield and toward their hand. So I think that ability nonetheless is also very good. So definitely a card that maybe we don't need 4 copies, maybe it's a 3 copies, maybe we put 3 copies of Pit Fighter, so it's 3 and 3. Yet again, time will tell where we kind of fall. Maybe Pit Fighter performs a lot better. Maybe we want to go down to 2 Valentines. Yet again, like I said, once I start playtesting and kind of see how the deck works, I will make my adjustments and update it as much as possible. But going into the 2-drop slot, we have Hungry for More. It's an interesting sorcery in the sense that it's a 2-mana sorcery, 1 red, 1 black. We have 3/1 black-red vampire token with lifelink and trample, and as also as haste. But we do have the sacrifice at the beginning of our next end step. So that's the one downfall to the card, but we can do it, we do it on turn 2, we can then do it on turn 3 if we don't have any plays. We do in the later game because it does have flashback, so it goes to the graveyard, we can play it at any time at sorcery speed and redo this all over again. So we do get two plays out of the 1 card if our opponent doesn't somehow have a way to target it and remove it from the graveyard. So definitely a good card in that sense. But overall, just being aggressive, just trying to get some additional damage, gain a little bit of life, and have a little bit of trample is always very good. Then we go to Shatterskull Smash-In as kind of like a little bit of that spot removal, as well as being a land if we really need that red mana source. The deck is a little bit heavier on the black side, I would say, with a little bit more splash of red, because most of our dual colored cards are red and there's not as many just red cards outright. So it's definitely one of those cards that may be tougher to cast if we're trying to move some creatures on the battlefield, but it is a possibility in case we really need to get rid of a particular card that may be in our way. But nonetheless, it is just a red mana source that we put on the battlefield by paying 3 life and having to come to the battlefield untap if we really need that red mana. Infernal Grasp is the removal of choice that I went with in the 2 mana slot. I do think it's overall one of the better removals. Just because it destroys target creature, we lose 2 life is kind of the drawback to it, but I think just the idea that there's no other drawback other than losing life makes it a very good removal spell, and it just kind of works with the whole vampire theme. Then we have Vampire Socialite. It is a 2 mana 2/2 menace creature that when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire control, so it just makes our whole team better if they've lost some life. As long as an opponent lost life this turn, each other vampire you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, so it makes all our future vampires that may get cast after it's already been played come into the battlefield that much stronger. playing it after combat, they'll come into the battlefield as either, instead of a 2/2, become a 3/3. So just being a little bit more aggressive is always very good. And just kind of, like I said, works overall with what we're trying to do, and is being aggressive as possible. Now back up to the top, we're going to go back to the Null Priest of the Oblivion. It's 2 mana, Vampire, Cleric with the Kicker ability. It is a 2/1 Menace, Lifelinker. Enters the battlefield. If it was kicked, we get to return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield, which is always very good. Getting cards back from the graveyard to the battlefield and, resurrect them essentially is always a good ability. If somehow one of our cards get discarded from our hand or just removed from the battlefield, we can always get it back, which is definitely very awesome as an additional ability. Worst case scenario, it's a 2/1 Menace creature that we can get it for some points of damage and gain some life out of it if our opponent doesn't want to commit 2 blockers to it. Then we have Bloodthirsty Adversary. Just because we're not playing a lot of non-creature spells, I did cut this back to only 2 copies. I do think more modern lists, if they're playing more non-creature spells, will have more copies of this. But it's a 2 mana 2/2 that we can pay 3 additional mana, and if we do, we could enter the battlefield with that many +1/+1 counters on it, equal to how many times we can pay that 3 mana. And then we can exile a target spell from our graveyard and then play it essentially for free. We don't have many things that we really want to target with it. Maybe Hungry for More, maybe an Infernal Grasp. Shadow Skull Smashing really doesn't really work with it, so really not many targets for it. So in a weird way, we can sink mana into it to make it a 3/3, 4/4, whatever it is, to maybe be that a little bit more aggressive. But worst case scenario, it is a 2 mana 2/2 haster. So overall, not a bad card. I don't think it also works very well with what we're trying to do here with playing vampires. So if maybe I add in some other non-creature spells to the deck, maybe like a spot removal spell, it definitely can become better. But as of right now, it's just a 2 copies of, can target some of the things, some non-creature spells in our deck, but just kind of seeing where it kind of fits, if it does fit at all. So overall, pretty decent card. Then we got a new card, Voldrin, Bloodcaster. It's a 2 mana 2/1, has flying. When it or another non-token creature we control dies, we get to create a blood token. Blood tokens are a new thing that all the new vampires have. Essentially, it's an artifact that has tap 1 colorless, tap this token, discard a card, sacrifice this artifact, and draw a card. So it's like a clue, but we have to pay a little bit extra in order to get the clue. And then whenever we create a blood token, if you control 5 or more blood tokens, we get to transform Voldrin Bloodcaster. So essentially, she becomes a stronger creature. Wrong card. So essentially becomes a stronger creature. I can't show you guys because I can't show you the picture, but it's a bat. But essentially the ability is it's a 3/3 flyer. At the beginning of our combat, turn up to 1 target blood token we control into a 2/2 black bat creature with flying haste in addition to its other types, so it's still a blood token. So overall, interesting card. I don't really know if the blood token, if this card's gonna be good. It seems okay because I think I like the idea of blood tokens, so a way that we benefit from playing blood tokens. So it's just something that creates blood tokens. It is something that we can do and get a slightly stronger creature, and then turns our blood tokens possibly into more creatures. So definitely an interesting card. Like I said, I just don't know where it lies, if this flip ability is really worth it. But I do think the main ability of just creating blood tokens when we play any creature that's not a token is definitely very good nonetheless. Then we got Florian. Florian's just a great, I think, 3-drop in the sense for what we're trying to do with vampires. It's a 3-drop 3/3 first striker. At the beginning of our post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the amount of life our opponent lost this turn. Exile one of those cards and put the rest on the bottom of the library in a random order. Then we can play the exile card this turn. So essentially, it's like kind of like in the humans deck, it's kind of like our dig ability to look for more, essentially spells or interaction for our turn. So maybe we don't do anything on our first main phase. We want to dig a little bit, do some damage to our opponent, look at, X cards based on how much life our opponent lost, and then possibly maybe find an answer or just find, a threat that we want to play against our opponent. Him himself having first strike is also very good, makes him a decent blocker in that sense. But overall, pretty cool card. It's legendary. You can't have more than one of him out on the battlefield, but overall, cool card that I think works well with what we're trying to do in the deck. Next card up is the Forsaken Forebear. It's a 3-mana flyer that's a 3/1. It can't block, which is unfortunate. But whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we can create a blood token. So you get again another thing that creates blood tokens. And we can pay 1 black mana, sacrifice 2 blood tokens, and we can return it from our graveyard to the battlefield. So in a way, it has a way to resurrect itself from the graveyard to the battlefield. So we can just kind of, even if it's in the graveyard but we didn't play it, we can always pay the 1 black mana, sacrifice 2 of our blood tokens, and then, you know, essentially get a 4-bearer back on the battlefield. And it kind of works well with the Bloodcaster because whenever another non-token creature, whether itself or another non-token creature we control dies, we could create a blood token. So it's kind of like a cool like little loop. So if this dies, we can then get it back by sacrificing the blood token that we're getting from this to replay it in that way. So definitely a cool little like loop. I mean, as long as we have more blood tokens, definitely cool there. We have the Immerstrom Predator. It's a 4-mana 3/3. If you don't know what it does, it's from Call-Time. It's a vampire dragon, so it's like our 1 dragon in the deck that's also vampire. Whenever it becomes tapped, exile to 1 target card from graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Immerstrom Predator, and then we can sacrifice another creature, and it gets indestructible until end of turn, and we tap it. So either we sacrifice a creature to give this indestructible, and then it gets tapped based on this ability, and then we also exile a card from their graveyard, give it additional +1/+1. Or whenever it attacks, it gets an additional +1/+1 as long as it can exile a card from a graveyard. So overall, pretty cool card in that aspect. But definitely a card that is, I think, one of those things we could probably use more copies of. And as we kind of maybe cut some of our other, 4-drops in the deck, we could probably add the copies to replace what we're cutting in that slot. So back up to the top, we're going to go to the Planeswalker playing the deck is Sorin. I'm not really sold on Sorin. It's an okay Planeswalker. It's not a great Planeswalker. It's a 4-mana 4-loyalty Planeswalker with a +1 ability that we look at the top card of our library. We can reveal that card, put it into our hand. If we do, we lose life equal to its mana value. We're not playing a lot of cheap things, so that is a little bit expensive. Because if we reveal our 6-drop in the deck, we're going to lose 6 life if we want to put it into our hand or keep it on the top. But we can put it 1 loyalty and not reveal the card, not put it into our hands, and then draw it on our following turn. It does also have the -2, and we create a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink, so definitely a decent blocker that can get in the way. And if we get to the -7, we can, deal 13 damage to any target, and we gain 13 life. So deal 13 to the opponent, gain 13 life. So overall, okay Planeswalker. Yet again, like I said, I'm not super sold, but if it's the archetypes, I might as well play it. So let's see how it plays out in that sense. Then we have Dracula the Voyager is the next card. This is kind of like the card that's kind of like, do we splash that white to play it? But essentially, it is the Vampire Lord. He is Dracula in that, and also in that regard. But it is a 4-mana 4/4. Other vampire creatures we control get +1/+1, so it makes all our vampires that much stronger. Whenever it dies, we get to return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. And if we click on the card, not that card, click on the card for card details. You can't unfortunately see the picture, but essentially it comes back as Edgar Markov's Coffin. At the beginning of our upkeep, we create a 1/1 black-white vampire creature token with lifelink and put a bloodline counter on Edgar Markov's Coffin. There are 3 or more bloodline counters on the coffin. Remove it and transform it. So then we transform it back to Dracula. So in a weird way, unless they can exile it, Dracula slowly comes back over time. So as the game goes on, even if they remove Dracula, we'll get Dracula back on the battlefield if we wait 3 turns. So overall, pretty interesting card. And just the idea of us splashing just that little bit of white to get that additional +1/+1 is always very good. Yet again, if we splash the white and we can figure out how to cut it in, maybe we put Rally the Ranks in. I don't really know. That sounds also really crazy, but it could work. We have 1 copy of the Blood Vial Purveyor. It's a 4-mana 5/6. Has flying, has trample. But the drawback is you're like, holy crap, why 4 mana for a 5/6? The drawback is whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player creates a blood token. And then whenever it attacks, it gets +1/+0 for each blood token defendant player controls. So the one drawback to it, where I don't know how good or bad it's going to be, is giving our opponent blood tokens. But the idea is if they cast things, they'll get their own blood tokens. This becomes stronger whenever we attack with it or defend with it. So definitely kind of one of those things that I don't know if this is something we want to really have, if it's that good at all. But it's definitely a very like over the top kind of card that our opponent just has to deal with. And like I said, the drawback is they get blood tokens that they can discard a card, sacrifice a creature, right? Sacrifice this artifact and draw a card. So, we give them a little bit of a card draw thing. So we'll kind of have to wait and see how that plays out. It could be something we add more of. Could be something we completely take out if it doesn't turn out to be that great. But it's an interesting vampire that got added with the new set. Then we have Henrika, the Damnathi. It's a 4-mana 1/3 flyer. At the beginning of our combat, choose one that has been chosen. So During our first combat, we can choose, each player sacrifices a creature. We can choose to draw a card, lose a life. We can also transform it. If we transform, we skip the other two because the other side doesn't have that ability. But when we transform her, essentially, because, the website doesn't put it in the middle of the screen, puts it on the top right-hand corner. But her flip side is a 3/4 flying, life, death touch, lifelinker. You tap 3 mana. Each creature you control with flying, death touch, and lifelink, and/or lifelink gets +1/+0. So it's just like a creature that gives all our lifelinkers, death touchers, or flyers an additional +1/+0 for 3 additional mana. Yet again, I don't know if I'm 100% sold on it. It's an okay card, nothing like holy crap. We played this 4 mana 1/3 that we're gonna get eventually a 3/4 flyer with all those things. So yet again, kind of one of those things that I'll wait and see how it plays out. But it is a vampire, so might as well try it out and see how it works. Then, kind of one of our big drops in the deck is Olivia's Attendants. We only have 1 copy of it in the deck just because it is so expensive. It is a 6 mana vampire creature with menace. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to create that many blood tokens. So it's a way to generate a crap ton of blood tokens very, very quickly. It doesn't have trample, so they can just chump block it with 2 creatures. But we can also pay 3 mana and make it deal 1 damage to any target. So we can ping creatures with it. We can also ping our opponent's life points. And then we can get a blood token every time we do that ability. So it does have an ability to at least get a blood token for 3 mana. If we have X amount of mana to dump into it, we can maybe create X amount of blood tokens out of it. So overall, a very interesting card. Yet again, is this a top-end card we really want to play? I don't really know. Is it too slow? We'll kind of wait and see how it plays out with this whole deck. And then the other card we have is Olivia's Crimson Bride. Is kind of like the card that I think was added in one of the packages you could buy for the pre-order for the cards on Arena. It is a 6 mana 3/4 flyer haster that whenever it attacks, return target creature from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Attacking, it gains 1 you don't control, a legendary vampire, exile this creature. So it's kind of one of those things that just is kind of a way to finish the game because it can return any vampire back from our graveyard into the battlefield, play and attacking. And the idea is that creature, is on the battlefield as long as we control a legendary vampire creature. And the way our deck is kind of set up, we kind of have like a decent chunk of legendary vampire creatures. So it's kind of one of those things that, the creature will stay on the battlefield for quite some time. I do think that if the creature that we put in the battlefield tapped and attacking gets, blocked and then dies again, I don't think it gets exiled. So I'll kind of have to wait and see how that mechanic plays out because it doesn't read that way. Let me know in the comments below if you think otherwise, but definitely an interesting card. It is going to take some messing around with to kind of see overall how it performs, but I do think 2 is an okay amount. I think 3 total 6 drops isn't terrible. Just the only problem is it going to be quick enough to even get there? Are we going to be able to get turn 6 to possibly drop one of these cards? Mana base is pretty straightforward. It is 24 total lands because we also have 2 Shadow Soul Smash-ins. But we play a decent amount of cards to kind of, hopefully get us to the black mana, the red mana, and also a little bit of white mana we're splashing. So we have Blightstep Pathways. We have 3 copies of the red-black one. We have 3 copies of the white-black one. We have 1 Den of the Bugbear just to have an active land that we can attack with. We have Haunted Ridge. We have 1 Hive of the Tyrant just to have it to attack the lands. 2 Mountains, 1 Plains, 1 of the Shattered Sanctums. Our 4 copies of the Shattered Sanctums. I don't think we need to have the white-red ones. I think that's overkill. I think having one that either produces white and red or having one that produces red and black is probably the best. I don't think we need to have the additional one that produces, red or white, just because white's it's important, but not that important. And then also 3 copies of a Swamp. So overall, pretty decent deck. Like I said, is something to be tweaked with, mess around with, kind of see how it plays out. But nonetheless, let's dive into the next one. Let's talk about it. So the next deck up is Gruul Warewolves. It's kind of a deck that I kind of want to really get into and play, but with this set coming out, I think the deck's going to change up from the set that the deck list that's kind of currently going on. And I'm kind of trying to get ahead of it and kind of see what kind of works and what kind of doesn't. And we're kind of playing like this snow werewolf style deck with some of the new toys that kind of got added into it. And I'm there's a couple cards that I'm like a one-off right now just because I'm unsure if it's a card that you really want to play something else with. But overall, pretty decent deck nonetheless. We are, like I said, playing snow lands, so we are going to play things like Blizzard Brawl. But yet again, is that kind of a card that we want to play in our 1-drop slot? If we're going to be able to consistently draw enough snow lands is going to be the other question. So yet again, I'll kind of see how that plays out. But we are playing, like I said, playing snow mana for the time being, just to kind of see how that works for copies of our fight spell to kind of, hopefully you remove things our opponent is playing. Then we have the Ascendant Pack Leader. This is actually a new card from Crimson Vow. It's a 1 mana 2/1. And just battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if we control a permanent with mana value 4 or greater. So if we get this in the later game, it can at least come into the battlefield that's a 3/2, which is definitely very good. And then when we cast a spell with a mana value 4 or greater, we can put a +1/+1 counter on it. So definitely one of those things, if we get it in the early game, we can play it, when we get to our turn where we can play 4 drops, we can possibly, have this get bigger very, very quickly over the course of the game afterwards. So definitely a card that, messing around with. Is 3 copies enough? Do we want to have 4 copies so we possibly draw consistently in the early game and then have it something that becomes a threat in the later game? Kind of one of those things we'll kind of wait and play out. The one thing I kind of realized after now looking at this is I'm kind of missing Ranger class. I probably want to add some copies of that. So if the list does change from the time I make this video, I may add the Ranger class in just to kind of get that, just because I'm looking at my 2-drop slot. I don't have a single Ranger class. I do think that's another card that any deck that's playing green probably should have. So you may see the deck list change from when I upload this onto YouTube for you guys to look at. After that, we have Inscription of Abundance. It's kind of like our early game possible other fight spell. In the late game, we can pay the 5 mana. We can get all 3 abilities, which is give target creature +1/+1. Target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures they control, and target creature control fights target creature we don't control. So like I said, 2 mana fight spell, 2 mana 2 counters, or 5 mana get all the abilities depending on the situation. So overall, pretty good card that definitely does a lot for what we're trying to do in this game. After that, we are playing the Cacique Naturalist, as it's one of those things that's a 2 mana 2/2 that whenever it attacks, we have to add a red or a green, so it's a little bit of a ramp. So even if our opponent can block it and possibly kill it, if we possibly play this on turn 3, have our 3rd land, we could possibly get out a 4-drop a turn earlier than expected, which definitely works very well for something like our pack leader. So overall, decent card nonetheless. It does start the Daybound Nightbound cycle of the deck, which then benefits us in the later game as it gets to nighttime, makes all our werewolf creatures that much stronger. So overall, pretty good card that works well with our deck list. Then we have Werewolf Pack Leader. It is also a human werewolf, 2 mana 3/3, which already is amazing. And then whenever it attacks, if we attack with creatures with a power of 6 or greater, we can draw a card. We can tap 4 mana. We can have its base power and toughness become a 5/3 and it gives trample, and it is inhuman, so it just becomes a straight werewolf that has trample now, which definitely gets us in for that additional damage. If we put like a Ranger class +1/+1 counter on it, it now becomes a 5/3, and then X based on how many +1/+1 counters on it becomes even bigger. So definitely very good there, and the draw ability helps us overall nonetheless. Then we have Cathartic Pyre, and this is kind of probably where I'm thinking of, probably taking these out and putting a Ranger class in. It is kind of one of those things I was messing around with before, and it's kind of one of those things that's good in the way that if we're looking for a way to possibly deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker for 2 mana is not bad. Also, if we're not really drawing what we need, or we are just getting land flooded, we can always discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. So we can discard 2 and draw 2 for 2 mana at instant speed, which is also not that bad. Just because, like I said, you want to be as aggressive as possible. So finding cards to play is definitely very good. And sometimes, the 3 damage target creature or planeswalker is not really good. So it's, like I said, it's one of those things probably going to get cut to put Ranger class in. So if this is not in the list, it's definitely probably the card I'll probably cut in the 2-drop slot just to kind of be able to squeeze it in. Then also in the 3-drop slot, we have Tolvar, Dire Overlord. It's a 3 mana 3/3 wolf lord creature. That whenever a werewolf or werewolf control deals damage to a player, we have to draw a card, so another card just helps us draw more cards. And we have our upkeep. If we control 3 or more wolves/werewolves, it becomes night, then transform any number of human werewolves we control, and also starts a Daybound Nightbound cycle. And then his reverse side, if you haven't seen it, he has an X and a red and a green. Target wolf or werewolf control gets +X/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. So he just had a way to dump some mana to give, maybe one of our unblocked wolves that additional damage to maybe finish off our opponent, or maybe even possibly kill the creature they may have chumped with that they didn't think was going to die in the process. So overall, pretty decent there. Then we got Reckless Summoner, 3 mana 2/3. At the beginning of our combat, creature we control gets +1/+0 and haste until end of turn, and it also starts a Daybound Nightbound cycle. So this can come out, give itself +1/+0 and haste, so it can attack immediately. Or if we play it in the or later on, we can give it to any of our creatures that come out afterwards. And then it flips around. It also gives a target, it becomes a 3/4, so definitely that much stronger. At the beginning of our combat, we, instead of giving +1/+0, it gets +2/+0, and then gives trample and haste in time to turn. So definitely even more aggressive. So if it's Nightbound and this comes out, it then comes out as a 3/4, that becomes a 5/4. So definitely an overall very strong card, depending on what the night and day bound cycle is. So definitely a card that's I feel like a must include in any sort of red / Gruul style deck. Then the next new card in the deck is going to be Cemetery Prowler. It's a 3/4 3-mana creature with vigilance, and then whenever it enters the battlefield, attacks, or we exile a card from a graveyard, spells we cast cost 1 less to cast for each card type they have that share. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card type they share with cards exiled with Cemetery Prowler. So in a sense, you can start exiling our own werewolves from our deck. And if our werewolves share that card type, we actually now have them cost 1 less. So we can then take our more expensive cards, have them cost that much less. Instead of paying 3 mana for a card, you're going to pay 1 mana or 2 mana. It doesn't get rid of the colored mana source, so if it still is Cacique Naturalist isn't going to get cheaper. It's still going to cost 2 regardless. But let's just say we have a very expensive 6-drop werewolf. It's going to, instead of cost 5, maybe it'll cost 6. It'll cost 2 green mana, which is definitely not bad. So definitely an interesting card. I don't know if 3 copies is too many, but 3 mana 3/4 with vigilance is nonetheless not that bad. Regardless of maybe we don't have any creatures in our own graveyard to exile, we can always exile our opponent's graveyard. So definitely good in that sense. And we have Arlen, the Planeswalker for vampires. She's a 4 mana 4/4 with Daybound, Nightbound. +1 until end of our turn when we cast creature spells as though they had flash, so we can cast them at instant speed. And then when we do, they enter the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter. We can -3, get 2 wolf creature tokens that are 2/2s on the battlefield. And then it becomes night. She can +2 to add red and green, or for 0, she can become a 5/5 werewolf creature token with trample, indestructible, and haste. So definitely overall very strong planeswalker that's definitely fits with like an aggro sense in that regard. So definitely Arlen is definitely fits very well in the deck. And like I said, if some of these other cards don't really work out, we can always add in more copies of Arlen, because I do think at least 3 copies is probably where you want to be, just because I do think she's that good and definitely that strong of a 4-drop. Then the next 4-drop in the deck, which I think is a card that's a staple for any deck that plays any sort of green, that's also aggro, and it's a Seeka's Chariot. That's because it's a 4 mana 4/4 wolf, our 4/4 vehicle that we can tap for. We can crew for 4 by tapping two creatures or creatures that equal power 4. Then becomes a creature. Then whenever it attacks, it copies target token we control. Now our deck doesn't have a lot of ways to create a lot of tokens, but we can also copy the cat tokens, the possible wolf tokens from if we play Ranger class, we can also copy the wolf tokens from Arlen. Other than that, it's just a very strong card that definitely just gets the board very, very wide very quickly for 4 mana. So overall, very strong card that, like I said, if you play green, you want to probably play this card. Then the next 4-drop we have is Ill-Tempered Loner. It's a 4 mana 3/3 that whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. So let's just say it gets blocked by a creature, and then any of the damage that gets blocked by any damage that creature dealt to this to block it, we can then throw it wherever else we want to. So even if this trades by getting blocked by a 3/3, we can throw the other 3 damage to something else and possibly kill it as well. We can also pump it to give a +2/+0 until end of turn by tapping 2 mana, which is definitely very good as well. So overall, it's a card that is very pesky, and our opponent really only real way to deal with it is to probably use some sort of direct removal or some sort of global board wipe. Just because it is kind of one of those cards that their opponent starts chumping, or any of that damage that they block it with will get thrown to something else and possibly kill their other something else. Then when it flips over, the ability doesn't really change, it just becomes a 4/4. And then the ability gets +2/+0 still, so nothing too crazy happens when it's on either the human or werewolf side. Just becomes that little bit stronger, which becomes a little bit tougher to deal with. So overall, pretty decent card. Yet again, do we want more copies of it? I don't really know until we play with it and kind of see how well it performs. Then the second to last card in the creature deck side of the deck is the Howlpack Piper. It's a 4 mana 2/2 that can't be countered, so definitely good against those more control matchups. But the idea here with the card is it's 2 mana, tap it. We get to put a creature card from our hand onto the battlefield. If it's a wolf or a werewolf, untap Howlpack Piper. Activate only as a sorcery. So most of our deck is werewolves and wolves. So we can play cards from our hand. Instead of paying 4 mana, we can pay 2 mana. And if it's a wolf or werewolf, this gets untapped. We can possibly do it again. And then when it flips over, whenever this creature enters the battlefield or transforms into Wolfpack Cavalry, we have to look at the top 6 cards of our library. We may reveal a creature card among them and put it into our hand and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. So the main side is really going to be the Piper side. I only have 1 copy of it, just because I do think it's kind of like one of those fun abilities, but I don't know, is it going to be able to be pulled off as often if we put more copies of it in? It's a possibility. Maybe we want to add an additional copy. It does also cost 4 mana for a 2/2. So yet again, we'll kind of see how it plays out. But for now, it's some one-off. If we do draw it, I do think it's going to be one of those things that our opponent's not going to know how to deal with it once we start putting werewolves out on the battlefield that are normally expensive in for cheaper. And then the last card is a one-off as well. It's a 6 mana 4/4 werewolf that has hexproof. You don't know what hexproof is. Hexproof is essentially like Shroud or any of those things. Our opponent can't target, this particular spell with a direct spell. So they'd have to do some sort of global board wipe to really remove the creature. But at the beginning of our combat, on our turn, we get to put 2+1/+1 counters on another target creature we control. So in it itself is technically like the aspirant of werewolves. It's a 6 mana 4/4 that starts putting counters, 2+1/+1 counters on any of our creatures, making them that much stronger. And then when it flips over, other permanents we control have hexproof, so it just gives all our permanents on the battlefield hexproof, so they can't target any of our permanents, even like our Seeker's Chariot. And at the beginning of our combat, on our turn, we get to put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature control. So overall, an interesting card. Global hexproof. If Howlpack Piper becomes like a thing and I want to add more copies of, this is also possibly something where we want to look at the deck and be like, okay, what other expensive things can we add to the deck to possibly get in for cheaper? So overall, it's one of those things we're going to mess around with, probably see how the deck overall performs. If the deck starts performing more and we want more Pipers, we'll add in more things that cost 4 or more. So or 3 or more, so it makes the Piper's ability, that much more effective. So nonetheless, overall, pretty interesting deck. Mana base, I don't think has changed too crazily from most of the Gruul things. We are playing Snow Mana for our fight spell, but we are playing 4 pathways, 4 of the Rockfall Veils, just so we can get our green-red sources, 1 layer, 1 Den of the Bugbear. So nonetheless, a very good deck. I do think it's going to be one of those things we kind of wait and see and how good it is. And on to the last deck. So the last deck here is kind of one of those decks that I do think like everyone wanted to kind of be a thing, especially when they saw this 1 card, Champion the Parish, get kind of previewed. It is a 1 mana 1/1 that whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under control, we get to put a +1/+1 counters on it. But I think the unfortunate part with zombies, it just kind of wasn't strong enough to kind of keep up with the more aggressive decks of the format as a whole. But I do think with the addition of the cards from Crimson Vow, we may be able to see, zombies become at least somewhere in the meta as some sort of thing, as something that may just pop up. And I think it's going to be a matter of kind of finding what is going to work with the zombies as a whole. This one's going to be a little bit more on the aggro side than maybe a little bit more the token generating, producing side of zombies. But we are going to start with 4 copies of Champion the Parish, just because I do think this is kind of one of those things that if we get on turn 1, it's only a 1/1, but every zombie we play after becomes even better and bigger. So definitely very good. We're also going to play Shambling Guest because it's another cheap zombie that can also help us a little bit of ramp and also a little bit of spot removal depending on the situation. That we can either chump block with, kill a 2/2, or chump block with, get a treasure token, or sacrifice 2 to like whatchamacallit, Deadly Dispute or something that we play in the deck. So definitely a good card that works well with the deck. The first new card that's like an uncommon, that is going to be one of those things that we're going to have to wait and see how good it is a 1 mana 3/3 Zombie Horse. As additional cost to cast a spell, we have to exile a creature card from our graveyard. And it's kind of one of those things that's just a 1 mana 3/3, which is definitely very strong. But the only problem is, are we going to be able to get creature cards in our graveyard to be able to target with this to exile in order to play it? Only time will tell. And then we can tap 4 mana, we can exile it from our graveyard, and we get to draw a card. So worst case scenario, if it ends up dying, we can always draw a card. So we're only doing 2 copies just because I think our other 1-drops we want out. Shambling Gas is, we're not gonna want this on turn 1. We're gonna want this in probably by like turn 2 or turn 3, depending on the situation. Maybe after Shambling Gas has gone into the graveyard. So it's definitely one of those things that we only want to draw in certain situations. We don't want to draw all the time. Then we have 2 copies of Tainted Adversary, as I do think this is kind of one of those other zombies that helps us get really wide really quickly, especially in the late game. As it is a 2 mana 2/3 Death Toucher, which is definitely very, very good for blocking because unless our opponent has first strike and go over the toughness, this definitely blocks a lot of things that our opponent doesn't want to just attack into. If we pay the additional 3 mana X amount of times, it enters the battlefield with that many +1/+1 counters on it, and we get double the amount of the +1/+1 counters on that it entered with as zombie tokens with Decayed. So definitely a deck that gets those zombies just very wide, very quickly. So definitely one of those things we only have 2 copies of, because, you know, our 2-drop slot is kind of like very interesting, just because, you know, we want some creatures, we want to play some of the newer creatures, we kind of want to see what's working with the newer creatures. So we went with 2 copies of, just because a 2/3 is good as like a chump blocker, but, you know, we're not going to want to have, you know, 4 copies of this, just because, you know, we want to consistently draw it in the late game to dump, you know, X amount of mana. You know, it's kind of one of those things that we kind of want to get in the early game sometimes, we want to get in the late game sometimes, depending on how it situates. You know, it'll kind of play out how it is. Infernal Grasp, yet again, is another card here. Very interesting card, definitely great spot removal. You know, to destroy target creature, lose 2 life. I can't say anything more about it. You know, nothing really that's too bad, especially in the early game. Gets rid of anything, regardless of what your opponent's playing. We went 3 copies of the Late Stitch Scab, as it's kind of like our Zombie Lord, makes our zombies just that little bit more aggressive by giving them +1/+0. You know, for 2 mana is not terrible, and also 2 mana 2/3 is definitely very good, definitely good at blocking. Then we also went 2 copies of Jadhar. It's kind of one of those ways to help us just kind of get that much wider. We can throw in a zombie token, you know, try to see if our opponent's going to block. If they don't, we can always, it gets sacrificed. Regardless, we get to get a new one. So it's kind of one of those things that repeats putting out a zombie token over and over and over again. So definitely good there. The other thing I'm thinking of is that these zombie tokens are going to be great for the exploitability. So having a way to create just token fodder to, you know, use to exploit is definitely going to be good there as well. And we'll get into exploit when we get to a card that has exploit. But, you know, this is going to be one of those cards that are going to help us kind of, you know, be able to consistently, hopefully, get our cards to be able to exploit. So the first card with exploit is actually going to be the Skull Scab. It's a 2 mana zombie that's a black and a white to play with the ability to exploit. And then whenever a creature we control exploits a non-token creature, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So it's not going to be great all the time, just because, you know, typically we're going to want to only exploit, you know, our token creatures, just because a lot of our non-token creatures we're going to want to keep. But, you know, exploiting like a Shambling Gas isn't terrible. Exploiting maybe, you know, a Cobbled Lancer, if we really want to draw a card, is not going to be bad. Or if there's some other thing that we don't want, we can always exploit regardless. So just having that additional ability to exploit is, you know, it's just definitely interesting. And the zombies that we create with this are 2/2 zombie creature tokens, and they don't have Decayed. At least that's what I'm reading, unless there's something that's missing on the preview card. But a 2/2 zombie that stays on the battlefield when it attacks is definitely very good. Allows us to be a little bit more aggressive. And we also have Deadly Dispute, just as another card to kind of like, you know, sacrifice one of our tokens, sacrifice, and to be able to draw a card, create a treasure token. So definitely good there. Drawing 2 cards is definitely good for a deck like this. So having some sort of way to sacrifice our zombies, get things into the graveyard, maybe for a Cobbled Lancer, get like a Shambling Gas out, be able to cast on our more expensive things a turn earlier is definitely going to be awesome in the later game. A card I'm playing around with as well is Morbid Opportunist. It's a 3 mana 1/3 that whenever one or more other creatures we can would die, we have to draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And that also accounts for our opponent's creatures. So if our opponent chumps blocks with something and that creature dies, we get to draw a card off of that. So definitely good in there. It is a 2 copies of, because in himself is not a zombie, it's a human rogue. So we're only going to play 2 copies just because it doesn't fit 100% with our synergy, but it's definitely a good card to kind of have that additional card draw in the deck. And then we have 2 copies of Agadeem's Awaken, just in case there's that scenario that a lot of our early turn, you know, you can see a bulk of the deck is, for the most part, it's 4 or less. There's nothing really that's 4, you know. So if we play a 7 mana Agadeem's Awaken, we're going to be able to get one of each card from each casting cost back onto the battlefield, you know, essentially for 7 mana, which is definitely not bad. So Agadeem's Awaken, I feel like fits very well with this deck. It's kind of like our Mass Resurrection spell. Worst case scenario, we can play on the battlefield as a black mana source into the battlefield untap if we want to pay that 3 additional life. But nonetheless, it's a great card to kind of play in this black deck that, you know, we want to get these cards back onto the battlefield if they do, you know, get put into the graveyard. Another card we are playing is Headless Rider, or it's a new card from, you know, Crimson Vow. It's a 3 mana 3/1 that whenever it or another non-token zombie control dies, we've created a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So this is actually pretty interesting. So if our opponent board wipes, we actually will be then create, you know, X amount of 2/2 black zombie creature tokens based on how many non-token zombies that we control die. So it's definitely going to be a good card to kind of replace our creatures that are dying from a board wipe. So our opponent will have to do 2 board wipes in order to really, you know, disrupt what we're trying to do. So definitely Headless Rider is one of those things that maybe we want to add 1 additional copy, maybe 3 copies is definitely something we want to have. So definitely one of those cards we're going to see how it plays out. Then we have Geralf, the Stitcher. It is a 3-mana 1/4 that gives all our zombie creatures that we control have fly-in, so now our zombies just fly over things. And then for 1 mana, we can tap it. We can sacrifice another non-token creature. We create an XX blue zombie creature token with X is that sacrifice creature's toughness. So maybe Morbid Opportunist is doing enough for us. Maybe we don't want to draw too many cards. We're starting to get low on our deck. We can sacrifice a Morbid Opportunist, and then we get a 3/3 zombie creature token because its toughness is 3. So definitely good there. Maybe we want to sacrifice a Cobbled Lancer. We can get a 3/3 zombie creature token there. The rest of our zombies aren't great. You can always sacrifice a Champion of the Parish when it gets too big. Our opponent targets it with something. We always sacrifice it in response. And then be able to get a replacement zombie that equals whatever its current power is. Unfortunately, it's not going to grow as well, but definitely nonetheless a decent card to mess around with. It's a one-off in the deck just because I'm unsure if it's really that good, but definitely something to mess around with and kind of see how it works. So another card that I'm gonna be playing around with if I play any sort of black deck is gonna be Hero's Downfall. I know the copy here is a rare from the set that this one's from, but it's in Crimson Vow. It's an uncommon. It's a 3-mana instant speed spell that destroys target creature or planeswalker. And it's going to be one of those things because Bloodshade Thirst is a sorcery, and that unfortunately costs 4 mana really to just destroy any planeswalker in the set. I think this is going to be kind of like that slightly cheaper one. If our opponent doesn't play any planeswalkers, we can always sacrifice a creature, make and destroy target creature that is really pesky. So it's definitely a removal spell I'm going to be messing around with and kind of see how it works out, playing this over something like a Bloodshade Thirst. The other thing, having an additional removal that doesn't lose life in the process that may cost that 1 additional. We'll kind of, like I said, also see how that works. But I do think this is a decent card. I think it was played back when it was out. They made it an uncommon, so they made it a tier, less rare, just because the power level of cards have just gone up that much more. But nonetheless, it is a good card, and I do think because even if it's an uncommon now, it's definitely be a card that you're going to see some play when you probably play against some mono black, or when you play against black decks like this. And the last card in the deck before we get into lands is going to be Overcharge Amalgam. It's a 4-mana 3/3 with Flash, Fly, and Exploit. When this creature enters the battlefield, we can sacrifice a creature, so we can exploit one of our creatures. And then whenever it exploits a creature, we can counter target spell, activate ability, or triggered ability. So this is going to be one of those cards that is kind of essentially like our counter spell in the deck without actually having to play a counter spell. We get a creature out of it. It also has flying. The one downfall is we have to have a creature on the battlefield that we have to exploit. So it is kind of like our way to maybe get around a board wipe in a way if our opponent's not expecting us. Maybe they just think we're all in on creating creatures. And I think exploiting is going to help us, like I said, also trigger Morbid Opportunist and things like that. So overall, a very interesting card. We're going to play 3 copies of it just because, like I said, I'm not playing any sort of counter spells, as I do think this becomes the new counter spell for the deck just because it counters target spell, activate ability, or triggered ability. And I think overall those are all good things, as there's definitely some things that if you counter a triggered ability or activate ability, it could make or break the game overall as a whole. So definitely a very interesting deck. Like I said, numbers will change based on how the deck performs. If there's things I think are overperforming or underperforming, I will remove and add other things based on that. I think there's other zombies that that I could add as well, but I kind of want to go with this list first, kind of see how it works, and then go from there. And then the mana base is nothing too crazy. I don't think any new lands got introduced that help this deck. We are playing 4 Clearwater Pathways. We're playing 1 Hall of the Storm Giants, 1 Hive of the Eye Tyrant, just to have some fight creature lands just in case the deck does get does get wiped, and we need some creatures to maybe finish off our opponent. We have 5 islands, and then we have 4 of the Shipwreck Marsh, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 swamps. But nonetheless, yet again, another very interesting deck that is going to be coming out with Crimson Vow. I do think, like I said, you're going to see versions of this be played based on how certain cards perform. Maybe this deck will start eking its way into the meta. I'll probably do some gameplays of all the decks that I've done in this video today, just because I do think each of these decks are interesting in their own part. So stay tuned to the channel for that. But guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. If you guys are interested in any of these decks, down in the comments below, let me know which ones you're interested in. If there's something else you're playing that you think may get a jump from Crimson Vow, let me know in the comments. But if you want to know when I post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. I will see you later.